Hey guys, my name is Ryan, and welcome to Overwatch Central. Today we sit down with Iostux, who is the head coach of Boston Uprising Academy, and we talk about the state of GOATS really, why it's on its way out, and the heroes that will be the reason as to why GOATS will leave, and potential future metas that Iostux kinda can't talk about because they're scrim secrets. You can check all of Iostux's stuff in the description below, but let's get started. So we'll start with introductions as we usually do, and then just a brief overview on mostly what the pros are playing right now. Is it still GOATS, and is it looking to stay GOATS, I suppose?
So my name is Iostux. I am currently the acting head coach of Uprising Academy, Boston Uprising's academy team in Contenders. And to answer your question, it really depends on what kind of level of play you're looking at. So if you look right at the top at Overwatch League, it is always a little bit risky to experiment with new things if you know that something old is going to work, which means that GOATS is probably going to be what we'll see mostly. Also because as the players get better, there are less mistakes that teams can effectively punish. And if there are no mistakes you can punish, then you can't really build a strategy around those weaknesses. But once you go lower, and once you especially go into ladder play, GOATS is still a good comp to play, but less so because it's the strongest comp, and more so because it's just relatively easy to play. But especially on a few maps like Gibraltar, for example, where GOATS isn't as good, you can start experimenting a bit more. Now that ASHE is in the game, for example, she's become a lot more prevalent, especially in lower ranked metas.
How about ASHE in like higher ranks then? Because a lot of pro players have said that they like her and enjoy her, but realistically, we have the Overwatch League starting next week. Do you expect to see ASHE poke her head in now and again, or do you think it's predominantly just going to be GOATS and maybe dive?
I think it'll be mainly GOATS. Some teams have experimented with ASHE, but I think most of them have realized that it's not really worth it, and because GOATS just works. And I know that's kind of a lame explanation for it, but in the end, they just want to go for whatever is the safest.
What kind of anti-GOATS kind of compositions have you seen being tried then, and why are they all seeming to sort of fall at the first hurdle?
So there aren't really any like super anti-GOATS comps, or at least there aren't any new ones. Some teams are running, some form of spam comps where you just pick characters like ASHE or Hanzo or Pharah, something along those lines, and you just try to pretty much deny GOATS a way to engage, and you just keep spamming until their shields break and they're forced to go off the point, and you can just capture for free. But even that can be a little bit difficult because it's very difficult to build a composition where none of the characters is vulnerable to GOATS just running you over. And even if they do that, eventually, they can just swap and counter you. So that's the main problem with comps that counter GOATS, is that those comps themselves are very, very easy to counter if the other team just swaps off GOATS.
We have the Overwatch League starting next week, and I kind of wanted to talk about the perspective that you have, at least, on the game and the meta that's going into it. Like, do you feel that it's going to be damaging to Overwatch and the Overwatch League if, say, scrims start today, and then the first week of Overwatch League, if it was like majority of GOATS, would you feel like that would leave a bad impression on a good portion of the audience?
Yes. I think that's pretty much unavoidable, and I think Blizzard knows that as well with the patches that they've been pushing lately. And I'm actually quite surprised because at first I thought that the patches would be enough to maybe deter the teams from running GOATS, but because Overwatch League works a little differently and the meta is a lot more, I guess, stubborn, like it's more difficult to convince Overwatch League teams to go to a new meta, the changes just weren't enough. And I think that's kind of the crux of the issue, because if you make very, very big changes, GOATS might be completely unplayable, or the characters in GOATS like Brig might be unplayable in lower ranks, but only then do you reach a level of change where Overwatch League teams would start adjusting, right? So yes, it'll mostly be GOATS. It's not really going to be great for the game, and they're not really in a position where they can just put out another patch and all of a sudden GOATS is going to change, because patching the game too often, especially during AL, is kind of a big endeavor. So that's probably something that they'll have to look at in between stages, most likely.
Right, and I guess we did see Blizzard trying to attempt to put out a couple of quick patches that would be ready for Overwatch League, especially with more nerfs to Brigitte. why in a sense have they failed then? Is it just that players have got so good at goats that they don't necessarily want to let that go? Or, like, I guess the question is, are more nerfs needed, say to Brigitte or to goats specifically, or do you feel it's a case of teams need to get better with other compositions to the same level that they have got with goats? Because that's seemingly why they don't want to just drop that comp, because they've put 6 months of practice into it, and even then, it's still a lot stronger than some other quick compositions that have been brought up.
Yeah, so contrary to popular belief, I do think the latter. I do think that the patch doesn't really need to change, but rather that goats disappearing is more just a matter of time for one of the teams to finally kind of break out of their shell, commit to something that isn't goats. It'll be on a per map basis, so I don't think goats is just going to disappear on all of the maps. I think the way it'll happen is you know, one team is going to run a different comp on one of the maps. You know, let's say Hanamura, the attacking team is running some weird spam comp. And then, you know, teams realize, okay, we really can't defend this with goats, it just doesn't work, right? So they're kind of forced to switch. And that is going to open up the opportunity to kind of see, oh, okay, so on this map, you know, goats is counterable, maybe goats isn't the safest play, maybe we need to be a little more innovative. The thing is, none of the teams want to spend any resources or time experimenting with other comps when they could use that time just practicing goats. But once one of the teams kind of just goes for it and they try out a new comp and they experiment a little instead of just practicing goats all day, and they kind of show other teams like, hey, you know, we've put in all of the work and something that isn't goats here is actually really good, then other teams are going to flock to that and they're going to try to kind of make their own spin on whatever the other team has come up with.
I've heard from Tavik when it came to other teams what they were practicing in terms of zany compositions that May was making sort of waves to an extent, like gradually wasn't going to be, obviously wasn't really going to be like the main counter to goats, but it does bring me back to something that we said quite a while ago with the changes to May. You said people were sleeping on them. I think people are still sleeping on them. Why do you feel that May is quite good in this period, if you still stand by what you said before? And why do you think that some teams are going towards May to try and counter goats? Like, can you sort of explain that for those that weren't sure?
May, again, is a character that gets progressively worse the higher the level of players. Because when you look at a composition like goats, goats doesn't really have a true weak point during a fight. Their strength remains relatively consistent throughout the fight. But if you look at May, when she is strong and when she is weak is very telegraphed. If she has her wall up, she is a very, very large threat. But as soon as she uses that wall, you have this window of opportunity where the enemy team is pretty much just playing a worse form than goats. So it is extremely, extremely punishable if you just mess up a single wall, right? So on certain maps, May, you know, goats variants with May or just May comps in general, do see play. And they work very, very well because that kind of trade-off of, you know, the risk of, am I going to land this May wall or am I not going to land this May wall is worth it. But on most maps, it can be very difficult to get good May walls, especially the more open ones. So at that point, teams are just saying, okay, we want, you know, consistent results. We don't want to rely on a May wall. And the main maps where you're going to see May are going to be King of the Hill maps. And the reason for that is because on King of the Hill maps, whichever team wins the first team fight has a very, very high chance of winning the entire round. And May is a character that excels during the first team fight, because all you need is just one good wall in order to win the entire game, whereas on other maps, in order to win the game with May, you're going to need a lot more than just one good wall, which is, again, hard to get.
That makes sense. Obviously, you can't really talk about your own strategies in terms of countering goats, but are there any heroes, like Tavik said that May Sombra was a strategy that teams were trying and it was doing okay, like people were sleeping on May in a lot of senses, which echoes something that you said way before. Are there any other heroes in the game that you go, people need to play this hero more, and then we might have an answer to this composition? Because like you said, it is just a matter of time before teams work out how to counter it. Like, at a glance, obviously, don't go into any strategies, but is there a hero like Farah or ASHE that you just go...
I mean, I can say that ASHE is a direct counter to goats. Yeah. Like, she does... Her dynamite gets a lot of value because So the way ASHE works is that both her Dynamite and her Bob, they deal like so much more damage if they hit multiple people. And Goats is a composition that wants to stay together, because if Goats doesn't stay together, they're gonna get punished. So against Goats, ASHE she gets a lot of value. And also her coach gun is a great way to just kind of make some distance to Goats, so she can't really get engaged on. So Hanzo was the character that was always kind of pretty good against Goats, but in most situations right now, ASHE is actually like the preferable over Hanzo, if not just running both of them at the same time.
I imagine that composition's going to, like, would it be double sniper then with a Widow, or would that be like an ASHE Goats kind of hybrid?
I guess we'll see when Contender starts. I think you can't really go wrong with Pharah anyways. Pharah is pretty much a pick that usually forces the enemy team to swap in order to counter you, which is always good in a kind of traditional comp set, because okay, so let's say you don't start playing Pharah, you just play something normal like McCree or Genji or whatever, and the enemy team doesn't have, like a really talented hitscan player in comp, right? They don't have a super sick McCree or a super sick Widowmaker. In that case, you can abuse that weakness and you can go Pharah. And in that case, either they're gonna stay on whatever comp they are right now, in which case you can do whatever you want, or the enemy team is forced to swap to something like ASHE or Widow, but they're probably not going to be super good at it. So the enemy team is in kind of a dilemma. Either they let you do whatever you want, or they're going to pick characters that they just don't really know how to play. So Pharah is a pick that you wouldn't necessarily open up with on every single map, but if you recognize that the enemy team isn't going to be capable of countering you super effectively, then having Pharah as kind of that pocket pick for a comp game can actually be pretty strong.
And that's it for this time. Thank you very much for watching. As I said, you can check all of Iostux's stuff in the description below if you want. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.